Chapter 11: The Later Middle Ages. Part 4, where we're going to discuss the social unrest that occurred throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries. This was a period of dramatic upheaval, as we've been discussing.
And in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 bees for a quarter, you'd say. Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. The important thing was that I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. They didn't have white onions because of the war. The only thing you could get was those.
In the 14th century, a new system evolved to make products on a larger scale. In this system, capitalist investors hired many households, with each household performing only one step of the process. Some shopmasters became so wealthy from the profits of their workers that they and their families no longer had to work in a shop themselves, though they still generally belonged to the craft guild. While capitalism provided opportunities for some artisans to become investors and entrepreneurs, for many it led to a decrease in income and status. Urban uprisings also were sparked by issues involving honor, such as employers requiring workers to do tasks that they regarded as beneath them. As their status and prospects declined, journeymen and poorer masters emphasized skill and honor as qualities that set them apart from less skilled workers. Guilds increasingly came to view the honor of their work as tied to an all-male workplace. In the 14th century, the amount of time that masters' widows could operate a shop was limited, as was the number of daughters a master craftsman could employ, resulting in a decline in women's participation in the guilds. Unlike in earlier time periods, a woman in late medieval Northern and Western Europe entered marriage as an adult in her 20s and took charge of running a household immediately, making her less dependent on her husband or her mother-in-law. Men of all social groups were older when they married. Journeymen and apprentices often were explicitly prohibited from marrying, as were the students at universities. Municipal authorities set up houses or districts either outside the city walls or away from respectable neighborhoods, as prostitution passed from being a private concern to a social matter requiring public supervision. Young men associated visiting brothels with achieving manhood, though for the women themselves, many of whom had no choice, their activities were work. Poor women and men also sold sex illegally, combining it with other sorts of part-time work such as laundering or sewing. Prostitution was an urban phenomenon because only populous towns had large numbers of unmarried young men, community of transient merchants, and a culture accustomed to a cash exchange. In the late 15th century, cities started to limit brothel residents' freedom of movement and to require them to wear distinctive items. Cities also began imposing harsher penalties on women who did not live in the designated houses or sections of town. Notions of female honor kept upper-class women secluded in their homes, but little effort was made to protect female servants or day laborers from seduction or rape. Same-sex relations were another feature of medieval urban life, but they were of relative little concern to church or state authorities until the late 12th century, when authorities began to define them as crimes against nature and made them a capital crime in most of Europe. In Florence, a special board of adult men, the Office of the Knight, investigated about 17,000 men suspected of sodomy. Most cases involved an adult man and an adolescent boy. The Florentine social sexual model identified the boy in the passive role as subordinate and dependent, while the dominant male was not considered to have compromised his masculinity. A variety of accounts indicated that sodomy was not a marginal practice, which may explain why, despite harsh laws and special courts, actual executions for sodomy were rare. Same-sex relations often developed within the context of all-male environments, such as the army or the craft shop, and were part of the collective male experience. Same-sex relations involving women almost never came to the attention of legal authorities, although both female-female desire and male-male desire were expressed in songs, plays, and stories. Many were living on fixed incomes, which were devalued with inflation. Because their chivalric code demanded lavish generosity and an aristocratic lifestyle, many turned to a crime as a way of raising money. Groups of noble bandits engaged in fur-collar crimes, roaming the English countryside and seizing wealthy travelers for ransom or demanding that peasants pay protection money to avoid having their hovels burned and their fields destroyed. Corrupt landowners, including some churchmen, also pushed peasants to pay higher taxes and extra fees. When accused of wrongdoing, fur-collar criminals intimidated witnesses, threatened jurors, and used their pull or cash to bribe judges. The popularity of Robin Hood, a hero of folk legends that relates the adventures of the outlaw and his merry men as they avenge the common people against fur-collar criminals, symbolized the deep resentment of aristocratic corruption and abuse and represented the struggle against tyranny and oppression.
I sent word throughout England that each village should send the very best men they have. And these are them.
We're in a lot of trouble.
Large number of peoples in the 12th and 13th century migrated from one part of Europe to another in search of land, food, and work. In the early periods of conquest and colonization, and all regions with extensive migration, a legal dualism existed. Native peoples remained subject to their traditional laws, whereas newcomers brought and were subject to the laws of the countries from which they came. The later Middle Ages witnessed a movement away from legal pluralism or dualism and towards legal hegemony and an emphasis on blood descent. Marriage laws were instituted that attempted to maintain ethnic purity by prohibiting intermarriage. Late medieval chroniclers used words such as genes, race or clan, and natio, species, stock, or kind to refer to different groups, and commentators increasingly described ethnic differences in terms of blood. Religious beliefs also came to be conceptualized in terms of blood, with people regarded as having Jewish blood, Muslim blood, or Christian blood. Blood also came to be used as a way to talk about social differences, especially those of noble blood who were prohibited from marrying commoners in many parts of Europe. A more positive effect of the development of ethnic identities was the increasing use of the vernacular rather than Latin. Two masterpieces of European culture, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, illustrated a sophisticated use of the rhythms and rhymes of the vernacular. The Divine Comedy is an epic poem of 100 cantos or verses that describes a realm of the next world, hell, purgatory, and paradise. The Divine Comedy portrays contemporary and historical figures, comments on secular and ecclesiastic affairs, and draws on the scholastic philosophy of uniting faith and reason. The poem embodies the tensions of the age, profoundly Christian. It also contains criticism of church authorities, and although it perpetuates the classical tradition, it is the first major work of literature in the Italian vernacular. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a collection of stories in lengthy rhyme narrative built around a pilgrimage made by 30 people of various social backgrounds to St. Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury. The Canterbury Tales represent a rich panorama of English social life in the 14th century, and like the Divine Comedy, reflects the cultural tensions of the time. Many of the pilgrims are materialistic, sensual, and worldly.
One thing is for certain, there is no stopping them. The ants will soon be here. And I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords.
A variety of evidence, including wills and inventories, attest to the increasing literacy of lay people in the 14th century. In England, the number of schools in the Diocese of York quadrupled between 1350 and 1500, with similar patterns seen in Flemish and German towns. Laymen increasingly served as managers or stewards of estates and as clerks to guilds and town governments. Such positions obviously require that they be able to keep administrative and financial records. With growing frequency, the upper class sent their daughters to convent schools where they gained the rudiments of reading and sometimes writing. Trade, commerce, and expanding government bureaucracies required an increasing number of literate people in general. That brings us to an end of Chapter 11.